I originally, there were ghosts in my novel, and they were just regular ghosts. I really like ghosts. I'm fascinated by them. And it seems like a humanless world, or a world approaching status as humanless, needed to have ghosts. Like, it should be haunted. He thought that, and rightly so, like, there's a lot going on. And he was mentioning, do we really need ghosts? Like, in addition to everything else in this book, do you really need ghosts in here? I was kind of like, yeah, I do need ghosts, but I wanted there to be some kind of logical reason for them.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching Leaf by Leaf, and welcome to the second episode of the Author Talks series. My guest today is Debbie Urbanski. A writer and lover of nature, her favorite organisms are green woodcups and pixie cup lichens. Her favorite forest is Morgan Hill State Forest, and her favorite hike is the Onondaga branch of the Finger Lakes Trail. She's eternally grateful to the Department of Environmental Conservation's forest rangers for not only protecting New York's natural areas, but also for airlifting her from Algonquin Mountain after a hiking accident. For the last 20 years, she's written and published a great many short stories in such places as The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, The Best American Experimental Writing, The Sun, Granta, and Orion. Coincidentally, she went to graduate school at Syracuse University at the same time as my first guest in this series, Adam Levin, though she studied poetry. At Syracuse, she had the opportunity to work under the guidance of luminaries like Mary Karr and Mary Gateskill. Her writing focuses on the intersections of horror, fantasy, science fiction, memoir, and/or the planet. When I likened her work to a combination of Richard Powers and the show Black Mirror, she said, "That is my ideal reader." But even this exciting combination, I think, circumscribes her incredible achievement with her debut novel. For example, it was rather unexpectedly Gerald Murnane's work that brought us together. Last year, I left a comment on an interview with Gerald Murnane on YouTube, and about a month later, Debbie Urbanski watched the same video and emailed me saying, "I was watching Drew Pavlo's great interview with Gerald Murnane and decided to check out the comments where I saw your name, which led me to your channel, which quickly led me down a wonderful treasure trove / rabbit hole of book commentary. I think several of our favorite authors might overlap. Murnane, Karl Ove Knausgård, Cormac McCarthy. So I thought you might enjoy my first novel, Afterworld, which came out last month from Simon & Schuster. Afterworld took Debbie Urbanski 6 years to write and 22 months to revise. I finished it in February of this year and was floored by its quality on every level. In addition to posting a brief review video back in March, I felt sure I would have to discuss it with the author at some point. Skip ahead 3 months, and here we are. Debbie Urbanski, welcome.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm so excited to be here. And thank you for reading that bio, because no one ever mentions my favorite organisms or getting airlifted for some reason. So
those were the two things I think that stood out to me the most. I was like, oh, now here's some real, this is a real person.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, they're good organisms if you ever get a chance to see them.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to see them in real life, but I immediately had to Google each of them because I didn't have pictures available in my own memory, unfortunately. But those cups were especially interesting.
Yeah, they're fun to photograph.
You're joining us from upstate New York, right?
Yep, I'm in Syracuse.
In Syracuse.
Yep, still here after grad school, just kind of stayed.
And this is also, of course, around where Afterworld is set.
Yeah, actually, Sen, the main character, lives in my house conveniently. So,
okay. Yeah, I noticed there was I didn't discover this until a couple of months or maybe a month after the first time I read it, but Sen actually has an Instagram account.
Oh, she does. Yes. I did that. I was still working on the book at the time and just needed something fun to do with my character. And we do a lot of hiking in the area where the book is set. But I still update her page because I find it very unsettling to look through there's no humans in her pictures. That's kind of the rule for it. So, and I see like abandoned buildings or things that look post-apocalyptic, which there's a bit of around Syracuse. So I kind of get the sense that I'm in Sen's world when I scroll through her photos.
That's it. That describes it perfectly. I ended up scrolling all the way down to the bottom so I could start from the very first picture and work my way to the most recent. And especially after having read the book, it's so plausible that these are pictures that Sin from your book has taken and that this is the world in which she lives, which of course is coming from you as the author being surrounded there. And I have to say too that apart from just simply being a really cool, what do we call 3D, 4D element of the reading experience, the photographs are actually extremely good. Are you a photographer? They just seem really, really well done.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I did photography in college and after a little bit. My dream was always to combine poetry and photography somehow. It never actually happened, but I liked the idea of working in two mediums.
It's funny you say that. I had a friend, a Sri Lankan friend of mine named Danush, and he was into photography big time, started going all over the world, taking these amazing pictures. And we had dreamed up this like photo essay type book where, but not, well, essay doesn't really get at it, but I don't want to be as presumptuous to say that what I would have contributed would have been poetry. But in a similar vein, he was going to take all these photos and then I was going to write, just, tap into my artistic sentiment and write something whimsical based on what we're looking at in the photo. Not necessarily a description, but not necessarily all the way to poetry either. But I think that would be, I would definitely indulge in such a book.
Yeah. Is that still in the works, your project? Or?
No, unfortunately, we both find ourselves again working for the same company, but we're both in IT and both overworked there. And I'm not sure if he does much photo taking anymore. And I rarely do any writing, but who knows what could happen in the future.
Someday project.
Yeah. And speaking, by the way, of being in IT and dealing with a lot of data and, of course, moving into AI and machine learning for a while now and predictive analytics and things like that from my field, I have to say that, I just commend you on this book because that stuff comes into play pretty saliently. And I just think that you've crafted this so well. Like I could easily find myself being told that you are in data and I'd be like, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. But as far as I know, you're not, right?
No, I'm glad to hear you say all that though. Because I did, I tried to do as much reading as I could. And my husband's a self-taught programmer, so he was kind of my technical advisor. But I started talking to people after the book came out. I started talking to some old friend who works at Google and some other folks. I kind of wish I did that while I was writing the book, but at the same time, they confirmed that, yeah, I did get it. I got it right enough for it to be believable.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah.
That's one thing that really always has drawn me to true writers, true novelists, is that sort of research and investigation side of the whole thing. You're going to tell this book from the point of view of an AI. So you have to kind of toe that line of imagination, but also plausibility so that, of course, the reader can abandon all of those constraints and walls or whatever. Great job, I guess is what I'm saying.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, there were times when I had to choose where, my husband or the article or book would point out, this wouldn't actually happen or that an AI wouldn't actually respond like this. But I had to for novelistic reasons. So it was okay as long as I was aware. And also, nobody really knows. I feel like it is a fiction. It takes place in the future. And
who knows what Pandora's box we've cracked open at this point, where we'll find ourselves.
Yeah.
All right. So the first question I have for you is in an email from months ago, you said you were surprised when your book ended up in the science fiction section of bookstores. And furthermore, you kind of wish we would just do away with genres altogether because they don't really help the authors or the readers. And then again, on the dedication page of your book, I noticed that you, first of all, addressed it to your mom, who let you stay up reading whatever you wanted, including lots of Stephen King, V.C. Andrews, and Leo Tolstoy. And throughout Afterworld and in its supplemental notes and in other emails that we've exchanged, your omnivorous reading habits are very apparent. Can you talk a little more about the benefits of collapsing generic borders and why you would like for Afterworld not to be limited to sci-fi?
I'm glad you brought up the dedication, because that was one of the most fun parts to write. It was a surprise for my parents. And I think, it's hard to be a parent of a writer who doesn't have a book for for decades. So I think they were relieved. They were also happy. And I really am grateful. Some of my favorite things about my childhood is that all sorts of, anything went with books and everything was valued. And my dad is a film archivist, film buff. And so we watched a lot of 35 millimeter movies, old horror films, and old sci-fi.
Yeah, I think your dedication then goes on to say, and to my dad who let me watch Night of the Living Dead and things like that, right?
Yes, yeah, at a really young age. So that was, really informed me as a writer, where being exposed to horrors, if it was, and sci-fi as if it was like everyday, whatever. So in terms of genre and what it does and what it doesn't do, I can't find many benefits as a writer. And even as a reader, I think it just creates limitations. A lot of my friends, for whatever reason, when this book came out, they mentioned, I don't usually read science fiction. And you might have said the same thing, I think, in your video.
Yeah, I think I did. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like genre kind of, there's science, people read science fiction, but not fantasy, and people read fantasy, but not science fiction. Literary people don't cross over. And I feel like those categories are especially outdated now, because there's a lot of cross genre. I don't know if you've encountered this, a lot of cross genre stuff going on where the borders seem very blurry.
Yeah.
So it seems dated. I'm still surprised that bookstores organize that way. I think publishers, maybe it helps them market. But in my case with Afterworld, I think people who are comfortable with like classic science fiction might not be comfortable with my book. Publishers Weekly, they were the first review that came out, and it was a genre reviewer. Both my editor and I were like, because they talked about using a science fiction genre lens to look at my book. So it didn't feel right to me. It was definitely a mixed review.
Normally I do go back and try to read all the reviews of a book, but after several disappointments that sort of started mid last year, just reading a book and then going and reading some of the early reviews. This happened with Against the Day. It happened with Adam's The Instructions. I would go and read these reviews and I would be so disappointed in the reviewer or the critic. It's just so clear that they weren't the right person for the book, and that they had a framework or a lens, as you say, through which, for my Against the Day video, I refer to it as a rubric. It's like there's this standard rubric. That's the only thing that they can see the book through, instead of sort of the other way around. I've always talked about letting the book construct your rubric instead of the other way around. This time, I purposefully did not go and read. I don't know what anybody else is saying about your book.
I think you're pointing out one of the things I love about your reviews and when you talk about books is you're coming at it from, I think we learn so much more from people who connect with books than people who don't connect with them. I think the negative reviews say more about a mismatch between the book and the reviewer rather than the book itself. So that's not the only reason. I feel like it's not just all about that review. I think genre, we should get rid of genre, but it just seems like it's something that might have been useful 40 years ago. And one benefit about being in the science fiction section is I'm next to Jeff Vandermeer. I don't know if you've read his Area X books, but
I haven't. I know about it. He's the one who did Annihilation, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I know of it, but I haven't. I've read, sorry to say science fiction, but like I did say early on, stuff that has been categorized as such is just not really on my radar as much. But you're absolutely right that there is this blurring that's taking place. One such is, I would say, Ted Chiang, if you've read his short fiction. So it is starting to open me up. But Jeff Vandermeer, he's one that I need to get around to, but I haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, he's in science. He's still on the science fiction shelf right next to me because of his last name, but he could easily be in literature. And my editor, Tim O'Connell, edited Ted Chiang, so he's a fan of Exhalation. He was the editor for that.
Well, how about that?
Yeah.
Oh, I love these little synchronicities that are happening.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed Ted Chiang, and I've enjoyed a couple from Blake Crouch. I
Oh,
would say, yeah. Blake Crouch actually is from about 45 minutes from where I live now.
wow.
I have noticed too in some independent bookstores, some of the section titles are starting to change. And some of them are actually getting really playful and really interesting.
Nice.
And there will be a section and it'll say something like, instead of mystery, sci-fi, romance, things like that, it'll say more something along the lines of the feeling of the experience the book would give.
Like that.
Stuff like that. And so I think that kind of gets maybe at what you're talking about. Publishers may not like that. It's kind of like that blind date with a book that some bookstores do.
Fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking if bookstores organized by length, I thought that could be interesting because sometimes
Oh,
I'm in the mood for like a 100-page book or a 600-page book, and it would force you to, I don't know, just look at a lot of stuff you usually wouldn't.
I'm kind of the same way. I sort of arc back and forth. I like really, really long, dense books, but then there are some of the shorter ones that are hard hitting in their own way. And going back and forth because, it's different types of investments, both time and emotion, energy. A big, dense, long book, of course, you're investing a lot more. And it's like being in a longer term relationship. Whereas, a shorter book may be more like going out for a night on the town.
Yeah, easier to reread the shorter ones too.
Yeah.
So I especially love when I get to the end of like a 100-page book and I'll just read it again.
Oh, yeah. Too Loud a Solitude by Bahudmil Harabal was like that. It's roughly 100 pages, but that was one where I got to the end and I'm like, yeah, I'm starting right back over.
Yeah. I'm in it might be my fourth time through. The book's called Signs at the End of the World by a Mexican writer. It's great. And I'm listening to the audio. I do a lot of audio books and every reading is just such a pleasure. And it's 3 hours long. So, I could.
Oh, perfect.
Whenever. Yeah.
On one of your hikes.
Yeah, seriously.
I did read somewhere, I can't remember where this was. Well, it had to have either been Esquire or Rumpus because those are the only two places that I did. But you said something about on your hikes, you like to recite memorized poetry.
Yeah. It started with my family and I started doing longer hikes. So we hiked around it's called the Tour of Mount Blanc. So we hiked around Mount Blanc. It took 10 days. 8 days.
Wow.
Or just our hikes could be, 10 hours long. So eventually we run out of stuff to talk about. And by the end, we all want something. We're all looking for something to occupy our minds as we get sore. So I started carrying in my pockets. Usually I found I could hike, kind of like scrunch up, print out of a poem. I carry poles. So I just have it here and I look at it.
Oh, that's amazing.
Talk to myself. So I'm it might be like I'm up to 12 poems that I've memorized, and I don't have a great memory, so it's been really empowering that I was surprised I'm able to memorize poems, but if you practice.
I probably know 2 or 3 by heart. It is, I've gone through phases where I'm like, yeah, I'm going to memorize a poem a month, and then I get into it and I realize this is actually sort of difficult for me. Like little lines here and there will stick, but I find too that I have a terrible time. Like I really have to work at it and do it a lot.
Yeah. It's such a great way to know language. So Sylvia Plath, I'm really into Sylvia Plath. So when I mismemorize something and I have to come back and realize, oh, it's like instead of as, or it's plural instead of singular, it really forces me to think why she did what she did, or why I keep inserting a different word, why she chose it.
Oh, I like that.
And yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Which poems do you know which are your poems by heart?
I know the Emily Dickinson poem about fame is a fickle food. I wonder now if I really do still remember Tennyson's Ulysses.
Oh, nice.
And then I have I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Who is that? Now I can't remember who that is. One of the big 5 of British romantics.
Yeah.
Wordsworth? I really can't remember. Good question for me. Unexpected. I'm not going to recite any of them though, because I know for sure that I will get very self-aware and blunder.
Yes.
The title of your book is After World, 2 words, whereas in the book, humanity's destination is called Afterworld, 1 word. The title then sort of sets itself apart and distinguishes itself from its proper place name we encounter in the book. And to me, presents an ambiguity between being either a preposition or an adjective, how we're to read after in the title. I feel like that small decision communicates something important. And knowing at this point as I do how deliberate you are with everything, I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Sure. So the original title when I was selling the book was The Transitionists. Nobody seemed to love that. So my editor and we tried using AI to come up with the titles. This was back with GPT-3. They were super goofy.
Yeah.
So we ended up with What Comes After the End. But the book went through so much editing, it took so long that by the time we were getting closer to publication, we both were kind of tired of the title. And so my editor I used the word afterworld, and he had highlighted and said, what about this for title? But he likes the idea of two words, I think graphically, especially because it does look nice on the cover.
Yeah.
But then I also really liked the idea because it makes the book into its own thing. There's the suggestion of the book as a place that's separate from, in my mind, that's separate from Afterworld or Maya it takes place in the novel. So I kind of liked, and it is what happens. The story where it kind of creates its own place, I guess. And I liked how the title alluded to that.
I like that. Yeah. And I was just looking at it broken into two words. And the way I'll hold it up for people to see it, but the way that it looks here, you've got three sets of two words: Afterworld, a novel, Debbie Urbanski.
Yeah.
So yeah, it does have that kind of punch to it.
Yeah.
I have to say, I don't know why I'm even sharing this, but I kept calling this Afterburn.
Oh.
I think that's an aloe that my parents used to put on my sunburns when I was a kid. But I called this to friends and typed it to friends over and over as Afterburn. I thought, why do I keep saying Afterburn? So kind of going back to what you're saying about memorizing poetry memorizing poetry and then going back and being like, wait a minute, it's Afterworld, not Afterburn.
This book, could be a challenging book, right? Or emotional book. So the idea that someone might have a burn or burn.
Oh, absolutely.
Cool.
In the author's postscript to the enormously successful book, The Three-Body Problem, Liao-Cixin writes the following. I feel that the greatest appeal of science fiction is the creation of numerous imaginary worlds outside of reality. I've always felt that the greatest and most beautiful stories in the history of humanity were not sung by wandering bards or written by playwrights or novelists, but told by science. The stories of science are far more magnificent, grand, involved, profound, thrilling, strange, terrifying, mysterious, and even emotional compared to the stories told by literature. Only these wonderful stories are locked in cold equations that most do not know how to read. What do you think of this notion that science could tell a far greater story than humans could?
I think it's interesting. I don't know if despite having an AI narrator narrate my book, I don't know if I agree with everything that the quote's suggesting. I think it gets to my feelings about genre, where my heart kind of seizes up during that part of the quote about possibility that the greatest stories of humankind, that there could be something greater than great literature. Because I think of like Middlemarch, it's one of my favorites, or The Wall by Marlon Haushofer. And there literally could be nothing better than those books. At the same time, though, I feel like the science could be equal to that. I don't think you have to stack. I think these genre categories cause people to be like, fantasy's better, no, science fiction's better, no. I think they could exist side by side. And the other thing about that quote is I feel like in the last 10 years, there's been really great nonfiction coming out about all sorts of things, but particularly about science. I don't even think I love science fiction, but I don't think the fiction part is necessary to get at how awesome science is. I was just rereading Midnight in Chernobyl. I wanted to incorporate some imagery of nuclear meltdown, and the descriptions in that book gets really wonderfully technical in my mind about nuclear energy, but also has a great narrative that happens to be true and has amazing descriptions of radioactivity and stuff, we shouldn't be seeing, stuff that people saw and then died. But just descriptions of that are so gripping. And I'm just thinking, I love reading nonfiction. Astrophysics, I keep trying to understand, but creation of the universe is just on its own is mind-boggling. And I feel like there's people who can communicate that well without needing fiction. So maybe I disagree with everything that quote said. I don't know.
It sounds like you and I resonate about the same in reaction to such things. And of course, it's going to depend on the person and their preferences and what really gets them, because to one person really digging in and understanding some deep equation, some deep mathematical quandary, and then finally having an epiphany could very well for them be the equivalent of you or I reading Marlon Haushofer and being gutted emotionally over and over. At the same time, I too read a lot of nonfiction science. You were talking about some of the astrophysics. Katie Mack has a book. Are you familiar with it? I think the title is The End of Everything, and then in parentheses, the subtitle is Astrophysically Speaking.
Yes, I have tried reading that book. I mean, maybe like 10 times. I'm not in the, I actually cheated and went and read Astrophysics for Young People in a Hurry, like the young adult version of the book.
Oh, yeah. Neil deGrasse Tyson, right?
Yeah. Because I was thinking maybe it'll help me understand it. I need to go back. I need to have the right headspace.
Sure.
Have you gotten through the book?
Yeah. I got interested. Well, a friend brought it to my attention, and then I saw she was a professor at nearby NC State. So I got interested. My nephew just recently graduated from there in biology.
Oh, cool.
And so my headspace was kind of there, but I think every bookworm, every reader understands about the headspace. And you kind of know. I've had plenty of books where I read the first chapter and I'm like, not right now.
Yes.
I'm not going to go write the book off, but just I know that I'm not ready for it right now.
That said, I'm no longer allowing myself to buy books about astrophysics because I love the titles and I love the descriptions, and I realized I'm just collecting them and I'm not reading them.
Yeah. The one that I have tried over and over is Roger Penrose, The Road to Reality. It's like very dense. It is not written with the layperson in mind. I've never gotten past page 100, and it's like 1,000-page book or whatever. But it's kind of the same way. It's just way too deep for me. But I can tell that for Penrose, like he's writing about something that is the equivalent of what, the three-body problem author is talking about the way he relates to these mysteries that are locked in cold equations that most people don't know how to read.
Yeah.
Because, they have the cipher. They're able to glean much more. All right, so as we've been saying, Afterworld is written by an AI entity known for most of the book as Storyworker. And then there's a supplemental system-generated ID that I'll leave out for brevity. But as the book unfolds, we come to realize that there's this whole hierarchy of innumerable AIs working under the umbrella of a near superintelligence named Jenny that humans have created. And this entity has suggested repeatedly that the most efficient solution to climate change, poverty, and world peace is to eradicate humanity's bodily existence. Managing the Storyworker AIs are editorial entities known as Emily, not Emily, but Emily, no I, right? I could be wrong, but I inferred this to be a nod to Emily St. John Mandel, whose book Station 11 recurs in your book. One of the great many spectacular performances on your part is the Storyworker AI's evolution as a writer and its increasingly antagonistic interaction with its AI manager, Emily. These elements do a fantastic job of achieving belief and developing empathy in readers for an AI. Can you talk a little bit about how you worked through that sort of potential impasse of winning over all too human readers in a book that purports to be written by an AI?
So the earliest versions of this novel, so back when I was finding an agent, it was in the state. There was no AI narrator. It was just Sen, and it was told in fragments and documents, kind of out of order. I wanted the reader to piece stuff together. But at the same time, there was like an emotional core to it, because I feel like Sen's story always resonated with me. I have kids, I have a daughter, and I could easily, for whatever reason, I'm a writer, so I could easily imagine, one of my kids in that situation, and just how frustrating and angry they would be, and hard to be for the parents. So I've had a few agents, but my first agent wanted to have some kind of narrative frame. She thought there should be a narrative frame around it. So that's when the AI entered. So I think on the one hand, it helped to have a story that have the AI telling a story that was already there. It was, it's like emotionally accessible to people. And at first, the AI voice went through a lot of iterations too. At first, the AI was learning to write even more than it is now. So it started off, it retold the first chapter, 8 times. I was having so much fun writing.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's fun.
At one point, I started having each paragraph use a different literary technique. So,
Oh,
one paragraph was all in alliteration. Another time, I told a scene through like using Morse code, hieroglyphics, Pig Latin. Each sentence was.
oh man. I would, I would pay good money to have that manuscript.
Oh, it was so fun. So when the book finally got sold, my editor was like, it was a very collaborative process, which I thought was cool. And sometimes I do need someone to rein me in a little bit because my stuff could easily be out. He mentioned maybe watching a narrator learn how to write is not as interesting as watching the narrator learn something else. So we kind of reframed. I had to rewrite it again, literally rewrite every sentence. But we decided that the narrator would be learning how to care for a subject, learning more and more about the subject until they fall in love with them, essentially, because they know them so well. And so that process to me feels, again, very familiar. Those feelings are very accessible because I think it's what humans do, like we do when someone dies, or if, I want to know my parents better and I'm looking at their letters or photographs, or if someone dies now, we have all their data available, their phones, their emails, So I felt like that would also make the narrator relatable, that they're essentially doing what a human tries to do, is understand somebody who they've never met, or they're trying to understand someone who they don't know well enough.
Yeah, it's sort of exactly what we've been saying with Liao has studied science to the point where he's fallen in love with it. We've studied literature to the point where we've fallen in love with it.
Yeah.
And now we have an AI who's digging into a subject so much they fall in love with it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I'm so glad and just so it's clear for people who haven't read the book, I'm glad that there's at least a kernel of your original vision of us seeing the AI develop as a storyteller. Like it's still retained in there. It's maybe not as overt as what you described, some of the different revisions that got tossed out, but it's still there, and it's often pretty amusing or funny. A lot of the different techniques that the story worker will employ, the story worker will also cite an article or a book or like a blog post or something like that. And some of those titles that you've clearly come up with are very entertaining, very amusing.
I did use GPT and ChatGPT.
Okay.
And so that is one case where it wasn't around when I was writing the book, but when I was revising and adding, all those citations kind of came in later. So,
okay. So you use ChatGPT to help come up with those titles?
Yeah. And I think that's something it's very good at. If you say like, there's an article about this, what kind of magazine would it come in? Give me some magazine titles or article titles. And then sometimes I'd have to piece together the words from different titles. But
in the IT world, and especially with programmers and data analysts and stuff like that, they've come up with this word to describe where our roles are headed, and that's called prompt engineers.
Oh, interesting. Huh.
So, the Chat GPT does the work, but we have to engineer our promptings just right to get out of it. But yeah, even one of them, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it said something about, it was like a study of readers and how often or how quickly the book they were reading went to their DNF file. And I just thought, which, for anybody who doesn't know, or maybe I don't even have this right, but I think that's do not finish, right? Did not finish. Yeah. So DNF, did not finish. And I just thought that as a bookworm, little things like that really stand out. And I just thought, this is great.
Yeah. There's a lot of fun. I enjoyed certain parts of the writing process a lot, and that was one of them.
As we said at the beginning of this thing, you've been writing and publishing short stories for over 2 decades. This is merely your debut novel. And so hearing you talk about some of the things that you put into this early on that didn't quite make it, to publication, I'm already very excited for your future. And, as you build up your readership and get these books out there, and people, especially editors and publishers, realize, this Debbie Urbanski's really got a gift here. I hope we see some of those Morse code chapters and alliteration blocks, because I mean, for me, it goes beyond just being like experimental, doing it for the sake of it. That really would be something that you could see an AI do as it's sort of like bootstrapping itself, crunching James Joyce and thinking, okay, this is what people like, but then maybe continuing to crunch things later in literary history and seeing, oh no, this is actually more what people like, and
trying out. Yep. In the section that was with Morse code and hieroglyphics, it was a disturbing section. And I think the story worker was trying to find a way to express it in a way that was less disturbing. So this was it. And I find that idea interesting, trying to kind of hide whatever.
A couple of the really disturbing things do happen sort of off camera. And it's interesting the how you pulled it off with the story worker basically saying, okay, kind of know that this is what really happened, but it's so disturbing to me now that let's just pretend this is the story that unfolded. I find that deliberate elision or oblique telling for certain like hard-hitting moments, even though I feel like a lot of literature is getting more and more explicit, especially with violence and things like that. I find that especially literature, I guess, it seems still so much more impactful and effective to let that to give just enough to where it blooms in my own imagination.
Yes.
I find that is sort of that obfuscation that you were doing with hieroglyphics and so on. I too still find that way more effective than just the explicit, description, kind of raw. But of course, it depends on what effect you're going for, because of course you've got Cormac McCarthy with a tree full of dead babies. It's like,
yes, yeah.
that should disturb me more.
Yeah, it makes it more participatory, kind of what you were saying when you get to fill in. And I guess with Cormac McCarthy, one did not want to participate more than...
No. In addition to the story worker bickering with its editor, it also begins to express wishes for human experiences. This to me presents an interesting contrast in the vein of the grass is always greener on the other side maxim. For the humans who construct Maya, which is the global contest-winning name for Afterworld, and notably linked to Greco-Roman mythology of fertility and motherhood and birthing, they wish for the digital experience. They say Afterward will, unlike the current Earth, be easily rebootable, a place of infallible balance and flawless rules containing more challenges, meta goals, and quests than this planet ever had. No species can ever go extinct no matter what is done or not done, and no human or group of humans can ruin the ecological balance, even if they tried. In contrast, as the story worker writes Sin's life, it begins to envy human life on Earth. I wish I could breathe is the first such anthropological longing it expresses. And later, the story worker writes of Sin's mom, Dana, reaching for Sin's hand and implies its longing to experience such a gesture that will also be very significant towards the end of the book. Can you talk about your thoughts on an AI developing these human-like traits, beginning, I suppose, with envy?
When I was towards the end, when I was writing this book, and then when it was coming out, there was a lot of discussion in the news. You probably saw it, just about people couldn't seem to agree. Does ChatGPT, are they thinking? Are they feeling? Are we being anthropomorphic? And I found it really interesting that the founders of AI or neural networks, like the big names, they didn't all agree with each other on what was happening, and there was a lot of fallout. Like, these are smart people who understand the technology, and even they had such different visions about what was happening. So I find it more interesting. I've interacted with ChatGPT a lot. I know it's become more advanced just in the last week, but I had it on my phone, was able to talk to it. It interviewed me for my editor. Thought, well, have an interview about your book. So we had a great discussion about Afterworld, and it was really fun. And the questions were hard and thoughtful. I had given it some summaries beforehand, but it did seem to understand. It either imitated understanding or it did actually understand my novel. So I like the second camp, thinking like there's more going on, that it's not just us being anthropomorphic, that maybe there's the argument that maybe we need to expand our definitions of intelligence and consciousness and even emotion, which I find really interesting. I like the non-human centric view where we kind of value other intelligences and experiences as much as our own. So all this leads me to, I just wanted to explain why I do think AI it's possible for them to experience emotion, which might be them imitating our ideas of emotion, but I feel like that's like splitting really fine hair. With Envy, the story worker was trained with large language models. You probably know because you're in the tech field. Hopefully I'll describe this right. There's a lot of different levels of training. So there's generalized training, and then it gets more fine-tuned as depending on what the final task is going to be. So with the story worker, they were trained on Sen at the very end, but above that, they were trained on novels, 21st century novels. Yep. So there's this thing that happens, from what I understand, in training, where the most recent training, the most intensive deep training, fine-tuning that a large language model had, sometimes the AI becomes kind of over anchored in that, and to the exclusion of their previous training or their guardrails or their rules. I was really pleased. I hadn't known that when I was writing the book necessarily, but I do think that's what's happening, where the story worker is getting so involved in humanity and Sen's life that for me it makes sense, kind of going back to what we said earlier, like the better we know something, the more sometimes we could love it. And so it makes sense to me that the story worker would want to get as close to Sen as possible.
Yeah, the levels of training are really interesting. And we get some figures in your book about like how many novels the story worker read in order to train and so on. But yeah, and it's exactly how we are. You know, we learn, like just thinking about learning to write, we learn these different levels. But if we were to learn just reading tons of novels, imagine the rule sets. They're going to be constructed and then wait, scratch that out, you know, because you're going to read one novel and you're going to end up with a rule that says, don't ever do this. And then you're going to read another novel and it's going to go completely against that. You're going to be like, oh, wait, you can violate that. And so, yeah, you're always sort of building rules and then throwing them out and reshaping and things like that. And yeah, I think it's so well done how plausibly. And the crazy thing is you're working within like 330 pages. That's really not a whole lot of room, at least by my standards. But somehow you're able to help us like actually experience or observe this change in the story worker without pointing it out. You know, you're very good at, I mean, it's clear that you've been writing for a long time. Very good at showing. I think that's some of the fun of this book, is acknowledging where the story worker is almost becoming maybe a little cocky about its ability to write, especially in the interactions with its editor, Emily, because Emily will say, throw an out of bounds exception. You can't do that. And then here's a story worker immediately shooting back and citing all these studies that Emily may not have read, saying, well, no, actually, that is often used in literature of this sort to show blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So with this book being written by an AI and the ideas of humans being digitally repopulated from their data, you know, we were just talking just a little bit ago about there's so much data accumulated on us now. And even people who have recently passed, it's almost, we're getting close to being able to resurrect people from all this data that we populate on Earth. It seems, Afterworld seems like a thoroughly materialist worldview, but you decide to complicate this view a little bit, in my opinion, or perhaps haunt this view with ghosts. Furthermore, between reality as we know it and the virtual realm to come, there appear to be variations of different types of ghosts here. At one point, you write, even unarchived data ghosts, such as Lindsay, that is Sin's other mom, can still form empty gestures of love and concern. In another part, you write, today, you write, / the story worker writes, today, Lindsay's ghost is in the kitchen for symbolic purposes, representing abstract concepts like regret, guilt, and trauma. And then again, later on, we get this, the fact of their extreme transparency and the bitter temperature of their surrounding air suggests they are real ghosts, not the data variety. So in these three excerpts, we have unarchived data ghosts, metaphorical ghosts, and real ghosts. We'll get to Lindsay more specifically in the next question, but for now, could you talk about your concept of ghosts within a framework that is typically or historically opposed to the metaphysical?
I feel like I can't talk about this book without bringing my editor up all the time. I originally, there were ghosts in my novel, and they were just regular ghosts. I really like ghosts. I'm fascinated by them. And it seems like a humanless world, or a world approaching status as humanless, needed to have ghosts. Like, it should be haunted. He thought that, and rightly so, like, there's a lot going on. And he was mentioning, do we really need ghosts? Like, in addition to everything else in this book, do you really need ghosts in here? I was kind of like, yeah, I do need ghosts, but I wanted there to be some kind of logical reason for them. So my husband and I were talking, and he mentioned this idea of empty data sets, null data sets. So this idea, when data sometimes uploaded, I guess sometimes there's remnants left over whose actual data might be erased.
Yeah.
So I liked the idea.
Interesting.
Yeah, I liked the idea of the humans having some kind of agency too, for the most part. Sen, she isn't allowed to erase her data. She tries early in the book.
Right.
But most people who aren't witnesses do have the choice if they want to. But so Lindsay, that was her intent, presumably, but something was left of her, and that becomes her unarchived data ghost.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. It's a little fluid because, as you noted, sometimes the story worker decides there's just going to be a ghost for symbolic reasons, or the ghost sometimes moves into actual haunting.
So they are all three in there, like all three of those flavors of ghosts are in there.
Yeah.
So you got your way in the end.
There is something, I don't know if you've noticed, there seems to be a thing with ghosts now in literature. Like, I'm talking to other writers, everyone's putting ghosts in their story. My next novel might have a ghost in it. Ghosts keep popping up. And I think... And
very nonchalantly, too.
Yes, right? It's kind of the genre blurring again. And then I'm really interested in how you mentioned it with AI. It does seem like people... I found a video online of a dad whose daughter had died, and he had a video of her dancing. So using AI, he created like a very long video of her. Not a video, I think it's like a live thing with AI where she's, looks like herself alive. She's dancing. There was a augmented reality of a woman whose kid had died. It's these tragic stories, but she's interacting with her daughter in this wearing VR goggles.
Yeah, and you're jogging my memory. Something that I recently read, but a family, they had just recently lost their child, and they were imploring the scientists to do whatever it took to bring them back in this way, from their data.
Oh, wow.
I can't believe it's not coming to me right now. Just kind of going back to the genre and generic misnomers and so on. Calling your book science fiction when the science in it is, I guess, boils down to an AI narrating a story and data archiving and things like that. But just as we've said, or you've said many times in this talk, it really isn't science fiction anymore because this stuff is actually happening. And I think eventually, at some point, it catches up because stuff that was called science fiction long ago, because it was novel science, novel is probably not a good word to use, but because it was new and notable science, it was like, oh, that's science fiction. But now it's like so commonplace that it's just part of our reality. It's like eventually, I think it'll catch up. Once this stuff starts really getting in, it'll just be the way it is. And what's called science fiction today will be realism tomorrow.
That's fascinating.
So to speak.
Yeah, like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was science fiction because the technology didn't really exist yet.
Exactly. That's a great example.
But now it's an adventure. And I feel like climate fiction too. There's this like cli-fi. I don't know if you
cli-fi, I learned that from you. Thank you.
I find it very silly. But I think it's hard to how could you write realism now without mentioning the weather changes or AI? I have trouble doing that. So it seems like you're saying, I think it could 5 years from now, stuff could all be fully entrenched in realism, I think.
There are several indications that Lindsay, an admin scientist overseeing the region's endangered species, knows a lot more about what's going on and possibly even had a hand in it. But one of the most intriguing moments is captured in a single sentence. When she's faced with the fact that S, which is the virus that enacts the sterilization of humans and ensures our extinction, that S has now been released, we read the following. Her one regret, that she won't be around to witness the world's rewilding. She wants to be here to witness it. Or maybe there's a way. An hour later, she pushes herself up from her desk and pretends she is still here. That last sentence is a masterpiece. And the hour-long lacuna that it represents is, to me, enormous. What happened here? And, well, first, are you willing to tell us? If not, that's okay, but that sentence is big.
So I think that assumes I know. I know what happened.
Good answer. Good answer.
With this book in particular, but I don't know if it's like this way in all my fiction, probably this in particular, I felt like I had less knowledge I did have less knowledge than the narrator in some ways, or Sun even. I imagined this story worker just having access, like visually and data-wise, could see everything that's happening. Sen actually lived through everything. And all I was seeing was like such a small part of it. So that said, I feel like Lindsay was probably thinking of how to become an archived data ghost, right? In my mind, I'm sure there's lots of different interpretations. So how she did that, it could be as simple as maybe she deleted her data, or I don't know. What do you think happened? Do you have a...
Oh, I love that. First of all, you've just reminded me that in the end, this book is told through the story worker, through the AI. So you're right. It just hit me again that obviously you're writing it in reality, but because of that constraint that you've designed in the book, you can't step in. And there is no external narrator. As a writer, you've just given yourself this constraint where everything that goes into it, you've got to think from the point of view of the AI having access to the data available to even write any of that, which I think is really laudable. Now, there is a section towards the end, I will say, the only thing I'll say about it, and I'll actually have you read from it here in a bit, but there is one section towards the end where the AI finally steps outside the constraints of the hard data, and it's wonderful. It's the best part of the book, honestly. But it's one of those things though where it can't stand on its own. Well, maybe it can, maybe it could be anthologized, but it gets its impact from everything you've read up to that point. But so there is that. But aside from that, basically 300 pages, everything that's going in there, you're having to think as the writer, you're having to think, okay, would the AI have access to this? And so you do have all these details that we haven't brought up in this video because the release of S and the human extinction is deliberate. It's a planned, coordinated event. There's an entire infrastructure around it such that they can begin to archive humans. And this is already happening, of course, with wearables and stuff like that now. But this is on a whole new level where there are microphones and cameras everywhere. And so this is how, just for those who may be kind of confused and haven't read it, this is how the story worker is able to construct a lot of these narrative moments. It's because of how heavily the infrastructure has surveilled Sin's world. Where was I going with that? Oh, yeah, you asked me. You said, what do I think happened? Well, it's interesting because there is that moment where we see Sin try to delete her archives. The whole point of the archives being, of course, that you get uploaded to Maya or Afterworld and go on with your, I call it virtual existence, but that may actually be a misnomer at this point because it is that line between virtual and reality is so blurred. And it does make you think about, well, if we had all this data at this level, and it's sort of the brain in the vat thing, right? Where this would be a brain in the hard drive. Would we feel virtual, or would we feel like, oh, this is reality,
Yeah.
But there is that moment in the book where she tries to delete her archive. She's like, I know I don't want any part of this. Just forget it. I don't want another existence in some digital world. But then, of course, safeguards are obviously in place because she gets an error message. You can't delete these files because she has the job of a witness. Her government sanctioned job now is you're going to be a witness and you're going to capture things that are ultimately going to be sent to the story workers, which is a cool cyclical thing that you've got in there. And I could go on and on because there all the little details around like how this would really get pulled off. You get in there so well and you figured out how to be really economical where you don't have to go on and on. Like if I were writing it, I would go on and on to where people would throw the book against the wall trying to describe, but you get right in there and you're like, this is how this actually got pulled off. Because at first you're like, okay, come on, this cataclysmic event is happening. They're sending her notebooks and telling her that she's got to write. But you've imagined this whole system, all this governance that basically ensures that yes, she will do it if she wants this, this, and this. And furthermore, she'll do it at really good quality. Because, for example, they won't send her food if the quality of her writing that gets run through an evaluation rubric doesn't hit a certain scale. So, I mean, just things like that is what really brings this book to life. But in thinking about that, yeah, I suppose that Lindsay, I guess she did go in and delete her files so that she couldn't be uploaded. And so she got stuck. But at the same time, the fact that, yeah, you've really got me thinking now. The fact that hour elapsed and it said she left, as if she were still there. The other part of that leads to suicide, in my mind, that it was both a digital and a physical
Well, that's interesting.
killing off
Yeah.
in that same hour. So I imagine her, in a way, she's sitting at her desk at work, and she decides there's a way, and she kills her digital self and then finishes her physical self. And the narrator tells us gets up and walks away as thus her ghost.
That's great.
Oh, thanks.
It's been really fun talking, the occasions I've had to talk with readers who I think the book's open-ended enough, and also my sense of what I don't have a firm, there's only this interpretation of it feeling with this book. So it's been fun to hear. The last someone I talked with recently, a librarian, was wondering if this all like a simulation theory where is this all a simulation? My editor and I had played around with the idea that this, like us right now, we're in Maya, we're in Afterworlds. I really liked, but that got that again overcomplicated. Like,
that's very Black Mirror-esque.
Yeah.
I find it remarkable too that your book not only takes on the enormous topics of love and personhood, which are already, of course, so complex in human life already, but then expands these topics across 3 domains of life: wildlife, humanity, and artificial intelligence. At one point, the story worker asserts that you used to need a physical, organic body to be considered human. Now, thanks to DHAP, that's the Digital Human Archive Project, a story can be substituted for a body. A story is a physical body. Anyone can have a story. Anything can have a... And then he is completely interrupted by his intervening managing AI, Emily. And in the author's note on human love in a post-apocalyptic narrative, the author here is the story worker. It says, I know many people, if there were still people, or entities, if there were entities listening still, would find the residue of anything human, including human love, to be unacceptable, or they would question my definition of love. But other people or things or myself would be grateful that such love once existed at all. And alongside these remains of human love, I think a new kind of love will develop that is even better and more powerful. Your book then seems to aim for nothing short of redefining personhood and love. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this is, the parts that you were reading were coming from the story worker. I really love that, even though I wrote it. I really love that love section. It still gets me kind of, because I think that idea is so beautiful. I think in my mind, the story worker, and same with the personhood idea argument, is trying to find a way that they too could have, if a story equals a body or a story equals personhood, then they could be a person as well, and be more on equal footing with Zen. And then with the love, I think that, that passage comes towards the end before the story worker does their grand gesture for Zen. Yeah. And I think they're preparing they want what they're about to do to be like the greatest act of love imaginable. And really, like, what kind of acts of love are left when nobody has bodies that would need to be redefined? So I think in the one sense they were trying to, the Storyworker themselves was trying to expand the definitions to include themselves. But I also love the idea of, rivers lately have seemed to be granted personhood, like the Amazon, there's some rivers in Canada. So we're starting to, I think, that gives them legal rights to, I was just looking it up today, legal rights to biodiversity or to be pollution free, or, so they have some protection. But I like this idea of personhood, not of us expanding our ideas of intelligence and emotion so it's not just so human centric. I think that'd be really good for the world.
There is a moment towards the end, like when this stuff is coming out and like you said, the grand gesture and so on. There's this moment that the way that you constructed this thing, it started blooming in my mind. And I thought, I had this like epiphany, and I thought, oh, wow, Afterworld Maya is going to be the child of the Storyworker and Sin. Right? And then you actually have the Storyworker call that ending out. It's stated a little differently. But I love it when writers do this, because especially with a book like this, where you've set up this amazing framework, not to be too reductive, but it's like there's so many, this thing is so ripe with possibilities, and the whole journey has been so enjoyable. How can you possibly end this? And yeah, it is a little bit open-ended in just the best way, like you were saying earlier. But as a reader, you can sense like these different ways it could go. And then you as a writer called some of them out and then still took it a different way. When that thought started blooming in my mind, it sort of encompassed exactly what we're talking about, is how with the system that you've got in place, with all the rules you've put in place, with the Storyworker and Sin and the data and all this, how could we get to a place where it's almost like the two of them, in obviously the Storyworker being AI, Sin being real, but now being archived in data form? Like, how could we jump to that love producing an offspring, basically, and that being Afterworld or Maya? The Storyworker says, this is an ending that I could have done. And then it moves on to a different ending. And I thought, oh, this is perfect. And I kind of felt like this was starting to hint at, and from what I'm hearing more from you during our talk right now, I felt like it was hinting at some more ways that you're going to sort of push these ideas in future books.
It did have a lot of different endings. I think there was one time all those endings were in the book. So, and I still wanted to acknowledge them somehow. So that's why. So your ending that you predicted was an ending at one point, but
okay,
somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's just such a poetic way of thinking about where this could go. I cannot stress enough. I feel like I've said this over and over, but I can't stress enough how expertly you handle details in this book. Your use of the dwindling number of matches to communicate the running out of Sin's, sentience, which I presume is a nod to the wall that we've brought up earlier, Marlon Haushofer. The game In Reverse, which allows people to simulate their real lives in several modes and in several time directions using data. The bureaucracy constructed around the transition, the notebooks, the manuals, the running lists of new and deprecated words. So you've even captured how language is changing because of all of this shift in the world. The job and logistics of witnesses, of which Sin again is one. The lists of things tried before S, which I think is very effective and it comes a little bit later than I expected, but I think it's all the more effective for it, because all the while, of course, you're thinking, surely there's a different way. And your list pretty well exhausts other things. And a set of book club-like questions that really could be effectively used by readers of Afterworld to get more out of it. I really want to dig into every single one of these and beyond, but to choose just one, time. Time is handled on several levels and within multiple frames. You cleverly insert clues for the scrupulous and inquisitive reader. I myself calculated the year 2110 as approximately the present time of the Storyworker writing this novel. And a Leaf by Leaf subscriber went even deeper, and I sent those details to you. The first time I read it and realized the whole narrative is constructed by the story worker in 6 minutes, my mind was blown in the best way. Computers, of course, are much faster than humans, but it just struck me afresh in your book. First, am I close with my calculation of 2110? And second, did you have the biblical 6 days of creation in mind as a structuring device for the story?
You were super close. The date that I had was January 8th, 2111. So that's
okay. Okay, I'll take it.
Yeah. And, who knows if my math was correct. I had a big spreadsheet and it went through a lot of changes. So one of us is right.
Well, I didn't take leap years into consideration or anything. Mine's very approximate.
Oh, but no, yeah, you're right on. And I remember when you talked about this book in your video that you mentioned the 6 days, the biblical 6 days, and I thought that was so cool. I hadn't thought of that, but I wish I did, and I loved that it came to you. There was a lot of formulas involved trying to figure out how many words could be created realistically from a large language model, and Emily's, I don't know. So there was and then also I was trying to figure out what are good breaks, what works as chapters. So the combo of the two. And so it just ended up being those 6 minutes, and then time kind of wanders off. I should use
we get a seventh minute.
Yeah.
At the very end.
Yes.
Yeah. That's unbelievable. And I am mindful too, of course. Yeah. You as the writer of the writer, the human writer of the AI writer. Yeah. And for an audience like myself, I don't think I'm digital yet, but thinking about you balancing writing something that's plausibly written by an AI, but still that satisfying feel of reading a novel for a human. I think you struck the perfect path in between, but I didn't know that you were kind of down to that level thinking. I mean, that reminds me of stuff like, I think it was in Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. Umberto Eco timed himself walking down a corridor and to see how many words, if he were having a chat with somebody who was walking with him, how many words he could get out, so that when his characters walked the same corridor in his book, they would get exactly that many words and stuff like that. Really optimized your book more than I realized.
Part of it is that, knowing the science fiction community, they tend to no one's done this, but they do look like with the hard eye on if people got their facts straight. So I have to mention this too, because I'm kind of proud of, it's slightly funny how long it took, but there's the table, is it in the very back of, that's on page 344, that shows the transmission logs for this.
Oh yeah. Phase. As it's going from satellite to satellite and then out to the stars. And,
so I have a friend who's an amateur astronomer who it took, I don't know, I don't quite understand. I think my math was totally off in my first spreadsheet. So he really helped me figure out, he triple checked the numbers and recommended certain exoplanets that would be good or certain items. So we were both very proud. I'm supposed to take full responsibility if there's anything wrong with that chart, but I think it's pretty accurate.
I definitely didn't start to try and scrutinize any of the technical information in this table because I wouldn't know at all. But I can tell you, just as a reader with a little bit more computer than astronomy, but this table that we get and sort of what it implies as regards the story is another little. If a table can be said to be a masterpiece, this is probably it. But yeah, if you're a hard-nosed fact checker about physics, just don't say anything. As we wrap this thing up, would you mind reading the section that begins on page 336 and ends on 338?
While Sen is fetching water down at the creek, I send her ghost mothers away again. Is this sounding familiar? This time with a few lines of polyphonic chanting and a pinch of salt. Like I wouldn't notice, Sen says, noticing upon her return. She drops the white bucket on the cabin floor and floats her own furious reflection on the water's turbulent surface, bringing her ghost mothers back. I send them away, she brings them back, and so on and so forth. There are only so many ways an argument can end. One way is a compromise. Couples who compromise in their relationship are considered skillful and healthy. Their relationship could last forever. Another way to end an argument is invisibility. Another way is a landslide. Another way is a detonation. I don't care about those other ways. Fine, I say to Sen, demonstrating my skillfulness. But they must stay in the woods. They can't go past this line. I draw a line in the ground with a pointed stick. For a day, 2 days, Sen's ghost mothers peer at us from the branches like peckish animals. They have non-reflective eyes. Then Sen erases the line. Then I redraw the line, and so on. The erasing and the redrawing becomes our compromise. This whole process is called adaptation, which brings me to that time of year when the garlic mustard near the edge of the clearing is bolting, producing clusters of radially symmetrical white flowers, while the strongly serrated edges of the nettle leaves are becoming more obvious. Under a maple tree, a female deer tick deposits 3,012 eggs into the leaf litter. The female deer tick dies. The maple leaves unfurl. The eggs of a field cricket hatch in a moist area of nearby soil, and the nymphs dig their way upward. Farther down the hill, near the creek, the eggs of the marbled orb weaver are hatching. A spiderling climbs to the tip of a buckthorn branch and floats to a new home on self-made threads of silk. A deer lies on her side near the patch of honeysuckle and births a fawn, licking the blood and the afterbirth from the spotted new fur. The fawn stands to nurse every 4 hours before nestling back into the understory. At night, out by the oaks, in a hollow tree, a northern raccoon births 4 babies on a bed of shredded wood. I am noticing a pattern here. A coyote lays on its side and births 4 pups, and in the underground den that was once a skunk den, licking the fur of each pup clean. The pups locate the female coyote's teats with their mouths and begin to suck. The red fox cubs emerge for the first time from their den into the maple stand near the pond, also known as Acres Pond. They rub their bodies against each other. A fox cub shakes its head. In the early morning, toward the end of the dawn chorus, a pair of black-capped chickadees sing variable notes to each other before mating in a wild apple tree beside the dirt road. Afterward, the female quivers her gray wings for a few seconds. In 12 days, the cavity nest belonging to these birds will be filled with eggs. The nest fills with eggs. The pattern I am noticing has to do with the generation of new life. I begin to quantify the amount of new life appearing all around me before I remember and stop. I remember the era for such analysis has passed. It's another era now. The cricket nymphs undergo simple metamorphosis. Sen's ghost mothers play peekaboo as if we are children again. And I am tired of describing ghosts and the nest eggs open.
I love that passage.
Thanks, thank you.
I see that as a great microcosm for the whole book. It kind of contains all the elements in that one passage. All right. Well, lastly, you and I, of course, have many similarities in reading. Gerald Murnane brought us in touch. And from there, we've spoken of Borges and Cormac McCarthy, Karl Ove Knausgård. We've talked about Sheila Heti, Richard Powers, and so on. A character in Afterworld takes House of Leaves along as their survival book of choice, which I could be wrong, but I don't think I've encountered House of Leaves in any other fiction that I've read. I don't think. So that was really neat for me, especially that book I have a sentimental attachment because I actually was reading that book in the hospital when my daughter was being born. Well, not when she was actually being born, but in the long nights.
Yeah,
and so on.
cool.
I took that with me. So,
Yeah.
And I'm a girl dad, so this book, hit me all the more. Your book hit me all the more. Yeah. Oh, and in the notes, you even implore people to read a book that we've brought up a couple of times now, The Wall by Marlon Haushofer. I could not agree more. I actually have to confess that rereading your book actually compelled me to go and reread The Wall. So I actually read it again over the weekend, and I had actually forgotten about the matches. And then I thought, oh my goodness, that's where the matches come from.
Yeah.
In Afterworld. So well done. So if you could recommend one book for me to get and read right away. This, again, isn't necessarily your favorite book of all time or anything like that. Just the one that comes to mind just based on our reading preferences and so on that you're like, Chris, you have to get this and read it. What would it be?
It's such a fun question. Okay, I'll try. I will. There's lots of books I want to say. I'm going to try and just say one. I might say two.
Okay.
I'll try and just say one. John McGregor's Reservoir 13. Do you know that book?
I've not even heard of it.
Oh, you're in for a treat. Especially that passage I just read, I think was really inspired by that book.
Whoa.
Yeah. So nice pick. It starts off as a mystery. So there's a missing girl, but it takes place over 13 years. There's a lot of symbolism around the number 13, but it's more about what happens to people in a town, but also the natural area of the town, the animals, the plants of the town, like the physical space of the town over those 13 years. So, and he wrote it by collage, from what I understand. So, he had the storylines going through and then kind of spliced things together. So you have human description.
Oh, that's a great sell.
Yeah, budding up, natural, budding up. And so I listened to it. I listened to it again. I read it. I've listened to it again. I mean, I kind of can't stop if I start. So, I think you'll love it.
Oh, great. Yeah, that sounds like especially, I love that it happens to coincide with some of the feel of the passage that I wanted you to read.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm sold.
The other one I'll just mention quickly, you mentioned on your TBR list is Ridley Walker. I know you've thought about that, but for me, it's like the most pure post-apocalyptic book ever. So it'd be a nice follow-up to Afterworld, where it's a hard read and it's also so rewarding and kind of mind-blowing.
It just so happens that I am going to be receiving Ridley Walker for Father's Day.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah, so I will consider the title, or the implied subtitle will be Afterworld.
That's a great gift. We love it.
Well, Debbie Urbanski, thank you so much for taking time to sit and talk with me, and congratulations again on this extraordinary debut novel. And I can't wait to see where you go from here.
Thanks, Chris. This has been a lot of fun. And if I could, just in closing, do one more show and tell.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Gerald Murnane, you mentioned, kind of introduced me to you in a roundabout way. So I had written to, he's really important to me on a lot of levels, but he wrote for decades without a lot of attention, which I relate to.
Yeah.
But he writes, I think he writes for himself and for this idea of an ideal reader. And I'm just really inspired that. And then also he got some recognition, later in life, but it almost seems like besides the point. He's
right.
So I wrote to him. I also shared an essay of a friend. I thought he'd enjoy the essay. And he wrote back, such a generous, here, I'll show you. This is a picture of view from his door, summer 2012. And then he wrote me this lovely note.
Oh, wow.
Where it was just really encouraging and generous. So I keep it near me because it kind of is a reminder of why I'm writing.
How fitting. That just brings us full circle. Once again. Oh, that's amazing. Well, thanks once again so much, Debbie Urbanski, for spending time with me. And once again, I wish you all the best.
Thanks, Chris. You too. Take care.